Hi, I'm Lucy and I'm totally not a robot. In this video, I'll be unboxing this. If you have good eyes, you might be able to read the sticker in the upper right corner, which says, Framework Laptop 13. More specifically, this is a model with the latest, Intel Core Ultra 155H CPU. The Meteor Lake line in particular has been sold out for a while, only available for pre-order, but as of October 2024, it looks like it is finally in stock. So even though I had to wait like 3 months for mine, your experience might be better. But here it is, so let's have a look at what's inside. While I'm trying to get inside the box, I must openly admit that this is not my first framework laptop. I got an earlier revision approximately 3 years ago, with an 11th gen Intel CPU, but it had issues that prevented me from daily driving it, so it ended up on eBay. Some of my main complaints include that the hinges were not strong enough, and the display was extremely wobbly, the CPU was getting very hot, and the fan was very loud even at idle. Oh, and only a glossy screen was available. I really wanted to give it a chance, but it just confirmed my general opinion that glossy screens are just unusable on laptops, no matter how much anti-glare coating you add. But what I want to say is that I do have a starting point, so I can compare. And one thing that I can say immediately is that the packaging is different. I got the DIY edition both times, and while the first one came in one piece, this one looks like it's actually going to need some assembly. Let's see what we have, starting with the bezel. Underneath it is a box labeled Input Cover Kit, which at least for me is hard to imagine, but luckily, the image suggests it is the keyboard. And after removing that, it looks like we have the laptop itself. It looks like I can still go one level down, so let's remove the cardboard and see what's there. Here are some of the expansion cards, but certainly not all of them. I expect to find more somewhere. Then, as usual, some fairy tales for good night's sleep. And finally, a box with accessories, which should contain the framework screwdriver and the remaining expansion cards. Let's actually open the accessories straight away. I'll need the screwdriver for the assembly anyway, and I'm curious about what else might be inside. But it looks like there are no unexpected surprises. First, there is the framework screwdriver, which comes with a double-sided magnetic bit. On one side it has a Torx head, which as far as I can tell, is the only thing you really need, as it fits into all the screws on the laptop. On the other side it has a Phillips head, though to this day, I've found no Phillips screws on the laptop, so I'm not really sure why it's included. And then there's the rest of the expansion cards, USB-C, SD card, DisplayPort. In fact, I should have all of them except storage. This is because I got the storage card last time, expecting it to be something like an SSD connected through Thunderbolt, but as it turns out, it is in fact just a fancy USB thumbstick. Let's move on and start putting the laptop together. The obvious first step is to unpack the laptop body. There it is, and it is great that it is already open, as I have to fit the SSD and RAM in. I did not get them from Framework, because their pricing is, well, a rip-off, beyond any acceptable margins or convenience fees. So instead, I have my own here, a 4TB Samsung 990 Pro SSD, and 64GB of 5600 MHz DDR5. Let's quickly unpack them and fit them in. First the RAM, that is simple, it just clicks in. Then the SSD, and for that one you need the screwdriver. Oh, I've forgotten that I've switched to the Phillips bit while playing around, and as I've mentioned, all the screws on the laptop are Torx. So with that sorted out, the screw goes out, the SSD goes in, and finally the screw goes back in. And that's it. Now let's have a look at the keyboard. I have the UK layout here, because I hate the tiny American Enter key. Let's see how it fits. It snaps right in place, as it is magnetic, but I still need to connect it to the motherboard, because the connector is now standing in the way. Beautiful fit. Now the bezel. You can get multiple colors, but I just have the basic black here. It is magnetic as well, but this one just roughly aligns with the perimeter, and needs a few gentle pushes to snap in place. I also need to make sure that it properly covers the cables connecting the screen to the motherboard. And I must admit that I'm getting a little bit worried about the hinges. The display still feels quite wobbly. I'd say good enough. Let's have a look at the bottom side now. First, I'll just tighten the 5 screws that hold the keyboard in place, so that they don't stick out. And with those firmly secured, I can now have a look at these 4 holes. These are slots for the expansion cards, and it is one of the main features of the framework laptop. The only I/O that the laptop has is the headphone jack, and the rest is up to you to configure using the expansion cards. I've partially mentioned the options earlier. You can get USB, video output, SD card readers, additional storage, or even an extra headphone jack. You can pick any combination that you like. At least one USB-C port is recommended for charging, but it is not a hard requirement, and the laptop will happily run with, say, 4 HDMI ports. And really, it is much less magic than it sounds. Each of the slots has a USB-C port inside, and the expansion cards serve as USB-C to whatever you need dongles, similar to the ones that you need to carry around with MacBooks all the time. And if you are a barbarian, you can even use the internal USB-C port directly, just like this. But please don't do that, and forever forget that I've even mentioned it. Let's do this properly and unpack some expansion cards. With my first laptop, only silver ones were available, but now you can get USB-C cards in multiple colors, so I want to check some of those out. They're not labeled or anything, but some boxes are more colorful than others, so I'll start with those and hope to get lucky. And look at that, I got a green one. Let's plug it in and try another one. Lucky again, this one's orange. Next I think I'll do HDMI, and there are no surprises here, this one can only be silver. Whoops, clumsy me. But there it goes, no problem. And for the last one, I think I'll go for a USB-A. Damn, same mistake twice, that's a shame. And with that in, I think I'm done. Let me quickly check how the colors work on each side. I guess getting used to it might take some time. Let's just plug the power in and see if it works. Okay, nothing's happening. Let me quickly double check that the keyboard is correctly plugged in. Everything seems all right, and in fact I think that my dumbness is to blame here. I did not have the other side of the USB-C cable plugged into the wall, and I'm almost sure that the battery has a shipping safeguard, which only gets it enabled when the power is plugged in for the first time. But since I'm already at it, I'll replace one of the USB-C cards by Ethernet. On first sight, this one is bigger, though it is most likely not because of the PCB, but because the Ethernet port is physically taller than the expansion card. Well, not the most aesthetically pleasing thing, but let's give it a chance. It still won't power on with battery only, so I need to plug in power. And I think that instead of wall power, I'll grab a power bank that displays power consumption, just to get an idea about how much it drains. Look at that. Now we're talking. Since it is the first boot, it is probably going to do memory training, which might make it look like nothing's happening for a while. But with enough patience, it looks like it is actually going to work. Let me see if I can get the video output through a capture card. TLDR, I can't. So, sitrep. It is now 2 weeks later, and I've been using the laptop almost every day. I think I've had enough time to get opinions on most things, so I've reset everything to factory settings, and I'll continue where I left after the unboxing. So right after powering on for the first time, the laptop complains that it has nothing to boot, which sounds about right, as the only storage media is the unformatted SSD. When I press enter, I'm presented with some sort of a menu, which lets me enter UEFI setup, or pick the boot device manually. At this point, I think I'll actually go to setup, because I want to tune a few things. And here's the thing, I remember that the UEFI setup app was terrible on the previous laptop, but kudos, they've somehow managed to make it even worse. Let me show you what I mean. I'll just quickly walk through all the settings, one by one, and I promise, it won't be a long journey. There is nothing interesting in the main section, just system information, and the option to set language and system time. So let's move to advanced, and dive into CPU configuration straight away. Not much here either, information about the cores, hyperthreading, virtualization, everything I want is enabled, so no changes necessary. Returning one level up, the first option is USB 4 measured boot, because why put it next to the other TPM or secure boot related settings, when it can be hidden here? Then a couple Wi-Fi settings related to Windows, which I don't care about, and VTD, hardware pass-through to virtual machines, because again, why put it near the previous virtualization settings, right? Next are a few options related to performance tuning, which I don't want to touch right now. Then PS2 mouse emulation, because the touchpad is apparently I2C, but no need to touch that either. And believe it or not, the Control-FN swap is the first thing that I'm going to flip, because as a long-time ThinkPad user, having Control last does not play well with my muscle memory. Right under, power button brightness, has a potential to be useful, but unfortunately the correct option is not even a choice at this moment. If you want the power button to shine by default, so be it, most laptops do that. But if you want to make this configurable, valid choices are on and off, and I can promise you, that high medium low is useful for around 10 people in the whole world, including the programmers and quality engineers, who get paid to surface and test it in the setup app. Anyway, I'll at least switch it to low. Next, a couple options related to standalone mode, which means the motherboard is not used inside a laptop, and that is clearly not my case. But the following one, battery charge limit, is certainly useful, and I'll set it to 80%. This will increase the lifespan of the battery, as charging to 100% sharp usually pushes the battery to its limits, which makes it degrade faster. So unless you really need the extra battery life, it is a good idea to set this to something like 80 or 90%. And the last option, battery disconnect, activates the shipping mode, where the battery is temporarily disconnected until a power cable is plugged in. Moving to the security section, first few options are related to the TPM, and though I won't be using it for anything, I'll leave it enabled for now. Then a bunch of firmware-level passwords. I don't care about that either, but let's jump to I/O interfaces and see what's there. Well, not much, really. I can disable the expansion cards, but not even one by one, it's all or nothing. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, that's pretty common, then the fingerprint reader, which I'm actually going to disable, as I don't want my fingerprint scanned every time I press the power button. And finally the camera, I'll leave it enabled, as it has a hardware switch on the bezel. That's it, just 4 things. Let's jump back, and quickly go through the last couple options, which are intrusion detection, and certificate management, neither of which is useful to me. I can now have a look at the last, boot section, where I want to tweak a few things. First, turn off Quiet Boot, which shows post information instead of the framework logo, though I have to admit that this particular BIOS is not very verbose, even with Quiet Boot turned off. Then disable Automatic Failover, as I don't want to automatically boot from random devices, not configured in the boot order. And finally, new boot device priority to last, which should not really matter with the automatic failover disabled, but it feels like if I don't set this explicitly, a randomly plugged USB drive might end up first in the boot order, which is pretty scary, and in fact I can't even imagine a use case where this would be a good idea. With that done, I can switch to the exit section, and exit saving changes, as there is nothing more to configure. So as you can see, we were able to go through all the BIOS configuration in around 5 minutes, including all of my unnecessary sarcastic comments. But let's move forward. I want to finally install an operating system. While the laptop was rebooting to apply the BIOS settings, I've plugged in a USB stick with Ventoy, which is a handy little tool, able to boot multiple OS images, using a single USB stick. And look what happened, secure boot violation, and I've expected this to be a problem. Unfortunately, I saw no options related to secure boot in the setup app, but let me quickly double check. No, nothing. And that's because secure boot administration is here, in the top level menu, rather than in the setup app. And apparently, I can't even run it, because I've already tried to boot an unsigned operating system. Let me reboot and try again. Luckily, it seems to work now, so I can disable secure boot, and I'll also remove all enrolled keys, just in case. One more reboot to apply the changes, and look at that. It looks like I might actually be able to install an operating system, and more precisely, I'll go for Debian 12. This might not be the best choice, as Debian is quite conservative, and might have issues with bleeding-edge hardware, but it's my favorite distro at this moment, so let's see if I can make it work. And while it's installing, I might as well mention that officially supported distros are Fedora and Ubuntu, both of which should, by framework's claims, work out of box. It looks like the Debian installation has finished with no errors, so let's reboot and see what happens. Look at that. It has booted all the way up into the desktop. But I have not won yet, because some things are not working. The touchpad is quite flaky and can only do left click. I still can't use external screens, and even the laptop display says it is running at 95 Hz, even though the panel is only capable of 60. And most of this comes down to the kernel version. Debian 12 comes with kernel 6.1, which is way too old for the hardware. The integrated Arc GPU needs at least 6.8, and the Meteor Lake CPUs got significant performance improvements in 6.9. But not all is lost. All I need is to look at the Debian backports repository, which does provide a few newer kernel versions. Let's start by looking it up. After opening the website, the left navigation panel contains a link to the instructions, where I will have to fight the half-working touchpad to select and copy the URL. But it seems that I've won, so I can now open the terminal, jump to a root shell, and add a new repository file to etc appsources.list.d, containing the URL from the backport's website. When that's done, I can do apt update to refresh the metadata, and I've just now realized that I should probably make the font a bit bigger to overcome the limitations of the only available screen capture technology. And finally, I can have a look at what kernel versions are available by running apt search Linux image. The latest available seems to be 6.10.6, so that's what I'm going to install. It might take a few moments, but once it's done, all that remains is to reboot into the newly installed kernel. Welcome back, now to a much nicer picture. The laptop is now running kernel 6.10, and most things, including the external displays, are now working. I want to do some performance tests, and I think I'll start with Wi-Fi. You can see that I got rid of the Ethernet expansion card, and the only available network adapter is Wi-Fi. And since I've already mentioned it, the Ethernet expansion card works as expected. It is supposed to be 2.5 gigabit, it does run at around 2.5 gigabits, but it sticks out of the laptop, which at least for me, is tremendously annoying. Back to the Wi-Fi, I already have an iPerf server set up on a different device, wired to a gigabit Ethernet, so let's see how the Wi-Fi performs. My AP is Wi-Fi 6, with 80 MHz channel width, and other devices have no problems getting over 500 megabits. I happen to know that the AX210 Wi-Fi chip that the framework comes with does sometimes have performance issues in the 80 MHz range, but in my case, it looks like everything is fine. I'm getting around 500 megabits both ways, which is what I'd expect. I've also tried it with a different AP, using 160 MHz channel width, and while upload speeds are very much unaffected, download can reach all the way up to 1 gigabit, so that's nice, I guess. Next I want to have a look at CPU performance. But I don't want to just run Cinebench. What I like to do instead, to at least partially simulate a real-world use case, is to recode a video. More specifically, I've downloaded the Big Buck Bunny movie at the native 4000 by 2250 resolution, and I'll downscale it to full HD. To be able to put the results into a perspective, I also have results from a few devices that I've already tried this on. And if you don't know what the Big Buck Bunny movie is, don't worry, I'll get to that. For now, this is the command that I'll use, and let's see how the framework performs. A bit over 8 minutes, not bad at all, that certainly puts it towards the top of the list, more precisely third place. To avoid random one-offs, I actually ran the test 5 times and averaged the results, which made it end up a few seconds slower, compared to the first run. But this is not the full story. The framework's cooling is designed in a rather unfortunate way, where the intake and the exhaust are both at the bottom of the laptop. That means that when the laptop is just sitting on the table, it actually has very little access to fresh air, and instead it just recirculates the hot air coming out of the exhaust. Which gets very noticeable if you put the laptop, say, on your lap. To framework's credit, due to the expansion cards and the 180-degree display, there is not enough space for the exhaust on the sides or in the front, but it still means that the CPU starts throttling much sooner than it could. Let me show you what I mean. I'll put the laptop on a laptop stand and rerun the test. Look at that, 30 seconds faster immediately, and after running the test multiple times, letting it properly cool down between the attempts, and averaging the times, it added up to almost a minute. But there is one last bit to the equation. I've mentioned earlier that the Meteor Lake CPUs got a significant performance upgrade in kernel 6.9, so I've ran the test on the default 6.1 kernel. And since the capture card does not work, and I was too lazy to set up the camera, you have to believe my word or try yourself, but even with the laptop stand, it took well over 9 minutes to complete. But enough with video rendering, I want to do another test. In a previous video, I've built Bamboo Studio from sources, and it took around 1 hour, 30 minutes for dependencies, and 30 minutes for Bamboo Studio itself. And in the video I've only said that I was building on a laptop with 8 CPU threads and 16 GB of memory, but the laptop was in fact the ThinkPad T490 listed in this table. The video render test was almost 3 times faster on the framework. Let's see if Bamboo Studio builds 3 times faster as well. Look at that, the dependencies built in 11 minutes, it looks like it might actually be 3 times faster. Let's run the second half of the build and see. "11 minutes again, so the results are pretty consistent, and I'm very happy with the performance. I must also say that even under full CPU load, the laptop gets nowhere near as hot as the previous one, with the 11th gen CPU, so that's certainly an improvement. The fan is still quite loud though. Let's move forward and test the Arc GPU, which I expect to be the most problematic. I want to see if I can get smooth 4K video playback, and for that, I'll go back to the Big Buck Bunny movie. But first, let me get rid of the battery widget, which does not seem very happy that I'm only allowing the battery to charge up to 80%. There, much better. Now let's have a look at the GPU firmware. It is not present by default in Debian 12, and no package, free or non-free, seems to ship the correct files. If I have a look at the kernel logs, the i9-15 driver does report missing firmware, but to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure how big of a problem this is, because VA Info reports that everything works anyway, and by feeling, the results are the same, whether the firmware is loaded or not. But I still want to fix this, so I've copied the lib firmware directory from Fedora 40, where it works. If I look inside the i9-15 directory, the 3 files that I'm interested in are mtl-huc-gsc-bin-xz, mtl-gsc-1-bin-xz, and mtl-guc-70-bin-xz. I'll copy them to my lib firmware i9-15 directory, and since Fedora uses compressed firmware, and Debian does not, I'll also decompress them. But that's not all, as the firmware is already loaded from the init RAM disk, I also need to call update init RAM fs-u to regenerate it with the firmware included. And that should be all. Let's reboot and see if it worked. And indeed, it looks like it did, because there are no errors anymore, and the i9-15 driver reports that the firmware is loaded. Let's finally open a browser and look up Big Buck Bunny. In case you don't know it, Big Buck Bunny is a short demo showing what you can do in Blender, and it is a nice, colorful, and royalty-free movie, great for video performance testing. On the website, I won't use the download link from the top menu, instead I'll go for the one from the high frame rate, 4K, and Stereo 3D release article. Here I'll find the standard 2D native render size of 4000 by 2250 pixels, which by the way is the file that I was downscaling a few minutes back. Let's see how it plays in the browser. I don't think I need more. I'm sure you all agree that this is nowhere near 60 FPS. Let's have a look at the CPU usage. And it's not even that high. I was expecting this to be software rendering, using all the horsepower the CPU can provide, but it looks like only 3 or 4 cores are in use. Nevertheless, the movie still plays far from smoothly. Let's give it a few seconds to see if it by any chance settles, but I don't have high hopes. Indeed, it looks like this is what it's going to be, and unfortunately this is not uncommon for Firefox. I'll have a look at the About Support page, which should give me more information about video acceleration. Scrolling a bit down, I can see that there are 2 GPUs, but only the first one is active. It says it is using the LLVM pipe driver, which is essentially software rendering. The second GPU's PCI ID matches the ARC GPU present in the system, but unfortunately Firefox doesn't know how to use it. And I'm sure there is a way to fix this, but I haven't found it, and for me this just doesn't work. Let's try Chromium, and see if it is the same. It does feel a bit better, but it's still far from 60 FPS. Let's have a quick look at CPU usage, and surprisingly, it is even lower than with Firefox. Still, this doesn't work. And I must also admit that both work fine out of box on Fedora 40. But enough with browsers, let's see if at least VLC can do the trick. And look at that. Other than the battery still getting confused, this actually looks quite nice. I still don't think it is full 60 FPS, but it's at least watchable. But there is a catch, you can't hear it, but the fan is spinning up, and it looks like the laptop is preparing for a takeoff. Let me check the CPU usage again. And this is interesting, by far the highest so far, with between 10 and 12 cores in use. I think this means that it's still software rendering, but this time it is implemented in a proper way, using as much CPU power as necessary. But there is something else I want to try. By default, VLC will use OpenGL for rendering, which I think goes through Mesa, and I suspect that is what makes it fall back to software. But after using the laptop for a while, it feels that the desktop is getting proper hardware acceleration, so I'll try to change the video output to X11, and see if it makes a difference. And in order to apply the changes, I need to restart VLC, so let's do that, and play the movie again. So far so good, I can't see a difference, everything is nice and smooth, but I can certainly hear a difference, because the fan has slowed down. It is still audible, but it certainly does not sound like a jet engine anymore. Let's have a look at the CPU usage. And it looks like my feeling was right, even though only a couple cores are in use, the video plays nicely, so it looks like this is the way to go. I think that's enough for the GPU, the video is getting super long anyway. One last thing I want to quickly try is the SSD. The Samsung 990 Pro is a PCI Express 4x4 SSD, and I believe the slot on the framework is PCI Express 4x4 as well, so theoretically, it might be able to reach the 7,450 megabytes per second, advertised on the box, but I doubt a laptop would be able to reach that, or in fact even half that. Let me try a couple tests to check it out. First, a simple HD palm read, and as you can see, this only yields around 2.8 gigabytes per second. Then I'll use DD to read the first 40 gigabytes from the SSD, and this is slightly faster, because this is where the operating system is installed, and therefore it is likely that some parts of it are cached and returned straight from memory. And that wraps up my performance testing, so let's jump to some final thoughts. Is the Framework 13 the ultimate laptop? Absolutely not. It has certainly evolved over the last 3 years, and it is now a better laptop than it was. But it still has one fundamental problem. The hinges were supposed to be stronger now, but it does not seem to be the case. Either the new ones are not strong enough either, or I got the old ones, because I don't see any improvement. The display is extremely wobbly, and even people just walking around are able to make it move. Or maybe I need to buy the stronger hinges as spare parts. I don't know. And since I'm already complaining, the fan is still quite loud, it would be nice to have an option to tune it. The expansion cards, as cool as they are, and no matter what combination you choose, still only give you 4 I/O ports, which is not too much. So is it a bad laptop? Also not. It is light, elegant, and actually pretty fast for a laptop. The battery life is also incredible. It draws around 6 or 7 watts at idle, and even with the charge cap at 80% I can get over 12 hours of idling, or 8 hours of light work. These are numbers that I haven't seen since like Ivy Bridge, and the best is that it does not even need a cell phone CPU to achieve that. And of course, the whole laptop is repairable and upgradable. Framework sells all the spare mechanical parts, as well as motherboard upgrades. Honestly, I can't wait to try the RISC-V motherboard. So am I happy with it? Absolutely. I've bought it mainly for editing videos on the go, and it is perfect for that. And this is where I'll leave it. If you're deciding whether or not to get one, I hope this has been helpful. And if you already have an older one, and consider an upgrade, the Meteor Lake line sounds like a good candidate.